Hi, I'm BJ Council, founder of UN50. As a retired police officer and executive, this job led me to my life's purpose. I served humans experiencing varying levels of crisis, trying to get jobs, housing, educational needs, health care, but due to personal barriers or overworked systems, these humans aren't able to obtain life's simple goal of just being stable. I believe if basic human needs are met, the need for law enforcement interactions are lessened.
So welcome back, everybody. This is UN50. We're out of Durham, North Carolina, and I hope things are well. Thank you for those that are returning to this podcast, and for those of you who are joining us for the first time. This podcast is part of the UN50, and we call it Your Questions, Your Power. And what we do here is hopefully try to help community members understand the importance of asking the right questions of their local law enforcement agency or any elected officials, and how data and analyzing that can be beneficial into those questions that you ask, and getting the information that you feel that you need from that to help make what they do transparent to you. So that's what we do here on this particular podcast. You can look at, listen to some of our earlier, a couple of our earlier ones that kind of give you more details as to what we're trying to do here. Because someone told me that crunching numbers and analyzing is a niche, and not a lot of people kind of know how to do that and ask those questions. And if you're paying attention in this country, anything always has, well, what do the numbers say? And that's kind of where we want to go with that. So our guest tonight is Bob Scales, who is a founder, co-founder, and CEO of Police Strategies, LLC. And I'll get to him in just a second. And then my co-host are Finesse Reno Rivera and Kelly Childress. So I'll let Kelly introduce herself real quick.
Hi, my name is Kelly Childress. I am a graduate from UNCG in the criminology department. My focus was sociology. I currently work with incarcerated individuals, helping them find employment. So that's a little bit of background from me.
Thanks, Kelly. Finesse.
Hi, thanks for having me back, BJ. My name is Finesse Marino Rivera. I have my master's in forensic psychology. I primarily work as a data analyst within the criminal justice system, specifically looking at criminal justice reform. I worked with institutions such as the DC Police Department, as well as the FBI. And I'm currently working as a consultant, as a data analyst as well.
Cool. Thanks. I appreciate that. All right, Bob, Mr. Scales, thanks again for joining us. And again, like I said, he is a co-founder and CEO of Police Strategies of LLC, and he uses data science and technology to help law enforcement implement effective policies, training programs, and accountability system. And obviously, when I saw accountability system, I was like all over that, because that's kind of where we are in this climate. So as you introduce yourself, Bob, and talk about what you do, I want you to talk about, obviously, your company, but also want you to talk about your police force analysis system, and then we'll kind of get into the meat of the conversation. Thanks again for joining us.
Well, thanks so much for having me. And I guess I'll start by giving a little background on how I ended up here. So I was a prosecutor in Seattle in the 1990s, and then I worked for 14 years for the city of Seattle as a public safety policy advisor to several mayors. And then I was in the city attorney's office as the director of government affairs. And I was there in 2011 when the Department of Justice came in and did their pattern of practice investigation of Seattle PD. And that ended up in a consent decree that the department's still under. And then the mayor appointed me to be the compliance coordinator to oversee the reforms. And I left the city in 2014 and formed Police Strategies with some former colleagues from Seattle PD. And we really wanted to focus on use of force, because, and this was sort of taking the lessons learned from the DOJ consent decree, which is that nobody knows anything about use of force because there's no data. And so we really wanted to develop a system for law enforcement that they could really do a deep analysis of how their officers are using force, and use that to improve their policies and training and accountability systems, as well as educate the community.
So what about this? Is that part of the police force analysis system? Is that what that is?
Yeah. So we call it the police force analysis system. So basically what we do is because there is no comprehensive database on use of force, no department has a great, they have basic databases, but in order to really analyze a use of force incident under the Graham v. Connor standards, which is the 1989 U.S. Supreme Court case by which all use of force is judged, and to determine if it's justified or excessive, you need to collect a lot more information, not only what the officer did, but what the subject did, what led to the use of force, what happened after the use of force. And so we collect up to 150 different data variables on each incident, and we get that information from the officer narrative statements and the incident report itself. So it's a pretty time-consuming, labor-intensive effort, but it's the only way to get the data we need to fully analyze the incidents.
You just did a research, and I think what I'm gonna do is we're gonna talk about that at the end, about the use of force research paper that you just did, a research that you guys just put out. But the thing that we want to talk about right now is the data. Because that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to help folks ask the right questions of law enforcement. So one thing that I've seen you write about a lot is just counting the number of vehicles that are being stopped by law enforcement in the community, and just gauging that number by, you stop X amount of number of Black folks, you stop the X number of white folks. And you're saying, if I'm reading your stuff correctly, that doesn't really tell you the big picture. If I'm interpreting what I'm reading, is that correct? Am I in the ballpark?
You are.
Okay.
I mean,
so I
basically,
kind of want to explain why the community member says you stop this Black folks this many times this way, and why that is not a good analysis to determine how the agency is operating in their community.
Yeah, so there are a lot of limitations from just collecting and analyze quantitative data alone. So if you're just looking at numbers, the numbers are not going to tell you if the officer is biased. The numbers are not going to tell you what the interaction was between the officer and the person stopped. It's not going to tell you about their demeanor and their professionalism and so forth. The numbers are just going to count things, to count the number of times things happen. And so what the problem that has been happening in the media and some legislators and different activist groups is that they're taking these numbers and they're reaching they're drawing causation, and they're saying, well, these numbers or these disparities exist because of something. And when there's no evidence that A causes B, it's just that there's a correlation between the two. And so we know, for example, that there are significant racial disparities when you compare police activities, whether it's stops or searches or arrests or uses of force, and the underlying population. And so there's no dispute that there are disparities, particularly for African Americans and Hispanics and Native Americans, depending on the jurisdiction. There's also a lot of underrepresentation in police activity for Asian Americans. And so the issue isn't, do these disparities exist? They do. The question is why. And once you are able to answer why, then you'll know, well, what can we do to reduce those disparities, if anything? And so oftentimes what happens is that the assumption is that most or all of the disparities are due to police bias. And so if you see, 10% of your stops are African American and only 1% of your population is African American, oh, that disparity is 100% due to police bias. And you can't make that causal connection. The numbers don't do that. And so it's correlation, but not causation. And so what you need to do is to go beyond just looking at simple population to looking at a more reasonable benchmark. It's all about picking the right benchmark. And so, for example, for uses of force, what we use as a benchmark are arrests. And so because almost all uses of force is associated with arrest. So the population doesn't have anything to do with policing activity. So the population includes, nursery school students who are very unlikely to be stopped by the police. It also includes senior citizens who are in nursing homes who are very unlikely to be stopped by the police. So why would you use population as a benchmark? And so when we look at use of force, the best benchmark are arrests. And so, because that's your population of people who are at risk of having force used against them. And when we compare uses of force with arrests, the racial disparities go away. So if 10% of your arrests are African American, typically 10% of your uses of force are African American. And so we don't tend to see these disparities when you pick a more appropriate benchmark. We also need to look at disparities by gender and age because we see disparities there. So males are much more likely to be stopped, arrested, and have force used against them by the police than females. And individuals between 18 and 29 are much more likely to interact with the police than juveniles or senior citizens. So the question is, are the police biased against males? Are the police biased against 18 or 29-year-olds? Or is there something else going on, the dynamic that's causing these disparities? And we certainly know that males are more likely to commit criminal acts than females. And 18 to 29, young adults are the most likely to be involved in criminal activity than juveniles or senior citizens. So you have to look at all the possible factors that can come into play with these racial disparities, including police bias. I mean, that's certainly a factor. I would never say that police bias doesn't exist, but it's probably not the major driver of these disparities when you look at disparities by income, unemployment, housing, education, healthcare. We see racial disparities throughout our society, and a lot of those factors drive criminal behavior.
Well, yeah, works for me. You guys got anything? I mean, it just makes perfect sense. But how does the community? I mean, how the community members are going to know that I mean, those numbers, what you just explained to us, a community member is not, they're going to just run with that number. You stopped a bunch of African Americans versus whites in this community. So how do we help them understand that? I mean, Finesse and Kelly, I'm trying, you know what I'm trying to figure out, because our goal is to help them understand. Yeah, those are numbers, but we want you to look at the true numbers in order to hold your agency accountable. So, I mean, how does that work for us, for the community?
Well, one thing I am a big fan of is in recent years, the FBI has been transitioning to a new data system for criminal statistics. It's called NIBRS, the National Incident-Based Reporting System. And so the old system just counted the number of crimes that people were reporting. The new system collects demographics, age, race, and gender on crime victims, and it collects demographic information on reported crime suspects, so age, race, and gender. And this has nothing to do with the police. So this is what the community is reporting, crime victims and reported crime suspects. And then it also has arrests by age, race, and gender. And so when you look at the demographics of victims, we see significant racial disparities. So African Americans are many times more likely to be a victim of particularly a violent crime than other racial groups. And also African Americans are more likely to be reported as a crime suspect by the community than other racial groups. And the police have nothing to do with those numbers, right? This is all coming from the community. So when we start to look at the racial disparities about, okay, who is being a victim of crime, who is being reported as a crime suspect, that matches very closely with who is being arrested, which is what you would expect, because the police are looking for individuals that have been reported as a crime suspect.
Right.
And so when you compare a better benchmark, which is reported crime suspects rather than the underlying population. So the question is, well, why are African Americans reported by the community more often as a crime suspect? And it's obviously not because of the color of their skin. It's because of, again, income, poverty, housing, all these other factors that we know there are racial disparities. So if you're operating at a disadvantage in society, you're more likely to engage in criminal behavior. So if we want to reduce racial disparities in policing, we have to address the underlying causes, and we have to invest in not spend hundreds of millions of dollars on police training and more IT systems and everything else to reduce the racial disparities and implicit bias training and all that kind of stuff. We need to invest in the communities, so that is less criminal behavior going on. And so provide better housing, provide jobs, provide better healthcare, education systems. That will reduce the racial disparities more than anything you can do with the police.
All right, Kelly and Finesse, because I'm
Mhm.
yeah, I want to break that down so our, for our community members. I mean, I heard it. I'm thinking in my head how to say that. I mean, I'm not saying that the people who listen didn't get it, but do you know what I'm saying, Finesse? I mean, I'm just Kelly. I mean, you guys
Yeah.
take a shot at that.
So I was thinking about something, and just bringing it back to, I remember in English, we started talking about like asking these questions and what questions to ask your community or your government officials about the data that's being collected. And so I was like, the simple questions when you're reading an article, what are you asking? Who, what, when, where, why, and how? And so those are questions that you can ask your data or the information that you're receiving from the media platforms, and just ask yourself, for example, like, who is providing the data? So the company, the agency, do they have ulterior motives? Who's collecting the data? Where is the data coming from? What are they talking about? What do I already know about the information? And just kind of thinking about what your information, with the information that you already have about what is being asked. And then what year was the data collected, and where, what geographical location. So you can start there by asking those just critical thinking questions about the information that you're receiving, which then kind of will lead to then you asking you'll know what questions to ask your government officials, if that makes sense.
It does.
So I think that's a good starting place to just question the information that you're receiving.
Okay, Finesse.
No, I mean, Kelly, you make a great point. Just to add on to that, Bob, though, I would be lying if I didn't say like just the hair kind of stood on the back of my neck when you mentioned NIBRs, because that's just a whole mess for the government, working on that for 7 years, putting all of these millions of dollars into a platform that's barely being used. I know back in 2021, even we were seeing California, New York, these major institutions not even providing their data, because we all know that's voluntary, right? So I also feel as though, when speaking about this, we need to take a step back and talk about, how valid the data even really is, going back to what Kelly had just said about asking these types of questions. But at the same time, it makes me wonder how we can have a larger discussion about how our community can understand the data, or even where to start. I mean, I think that's the bigger conversation here, is to really understand like how they're even supposed to know how to ask those questions. With Kelly, like what you just said, like that's not intuitive just for anyone.
Right.
For us, it's like an everyday run-the-mill thing. But I think the bigger question is, how to get our community to really understand it and how to utilize it, and take a step back and be able to apply everything that we just talked about, including what Bob said, which it made complete sense, and was thank you so much for that. That was mind-blowing, actually. I was like, I never really thought about it that way. But it also links back to you, BJ, about what you talk about, what you preach about, how important education is, and housing, and everything we've also talked about in our previous sessions.
So I kind of want to talk. I'm with Finesse. I'm sitting here going, "Wow, Bob, that was awesome." And I kind of want to make sure that I want to say what you said, but I want to make sure I'm saying it the way I heard it. Because basically, what I heard was that our community, the Black community, we're victims, and then we're victimized by, we're calling in the crimes. So that means we're calling police officers in. because we're victims of a crime. And then the persons that we're describing as to who victimize us more often than not are African American. So in order, the use of force and the engagement or the interaction is because we're calling police into our communities because we're victimized, and then the individuals who are victimizing us are African Americans. And then we use that data to start looking at everything else, you know, the arrest, the use of force, and those types of things, but also understanding that our community is generating a lot of those numbers.
Yeah, and also it's yeah, exactly. But the other thing is that the numbers, there's still limitations on what we can tell from the numbers. So for example, the numbers are not gonna tell us if the officer used justified force or
Right.
excessive force.
Right.
And so we have to combine the sort of quantitative analysis with a qualitative analysis. So we can't just say, you know, oh, there's no disparity here, therefore there's no problem. Because you can have no disparities and still have a problem with use of force, right? So even though your racial disparities might not be there, your officers may be routinely using unjustified force.
Right.
And so you can't just rely on the quantitative data. Um, and it is complex to try to, because part of the problem is that the media in particular now has really simplified things. I mean, I've seen so many headlines that just read, you know, blacks are 5 times more likely than whites to be stopped by the police. And so that immediately, you know, conjures up, okay, well, that's because of profiling or bias or racism or something like that. And there's never any attempt to understand why those disparities exist. But the common assumption now is that the police are there is widespread bias in policing, and that is what's driving the numbers. And we need to really step back and look at all these other factors, such as victimization and reported crime suspects. But also, this isn't about sort of letting the police off the hook. We also have to really scrutinize whenever the police do use force. I mean, it should be heavily scrutinized, and in most cases it is. But for example, like there are about between 1,100 and 1,200 officer involved shooting deaths a year. And that number has not changed in the last 20 years. It varies between 1,100 and 1,200 every year. And that's despite consent decrees, state legislative reform, all sorts of new training programs, technology, less lethal weapons. You still have this same amount of officer involved shooting deaths. And many people will say, well, this is too high. This is just too high. There should be many less, and the police must be doing something wrong. But every year, less than 2% of those officer-involved shootings, which are all heavily scrutinized by prosecutors and the media and so forth, less than 2% are found to be unjustified or unlawful. And there are about 25 to 30 officers who are prosecuted in the country each year for unlawful uses of force, and the conviction rate is even lower than that. But based on those numbers, it seems like the system is working at holding officers accountable. That doesn't mean that there are, I mean, these are all going to be judgment calls too, and it's going to depend on your policies and your training. But it doesn't appear that we have this massive number of incidents where there's unjustified shootings where the officers are not being held accountable. And because the numbers just haven't changed that much over the years. And despite all of our efforts at reform and civilian oversight and everything else, the numbers are pretty much the same. So, and when you look at the data, because there are some media outlets like the Washington Post and the Guardian newspaper and Mapping Police Violence and Fatal Encounters that have gathered data from public sources, because the federal government won't release any of their data. But when you look at that data, it's amazing how little things change over time, despite all these other external factors that have been trying to change policing. And so that sort of suggests to me that there are other factors going on, particularly suspect behavior, if almost all your use of deadly force is found to be justified, then that means that it's that the officers are routinely facing or regularly facing some kind of deadly threat where it's justified to use deadly force. And so, and just to get just jump a little bit to Finesse's point about NIBRs, I totally agree. I mean, the bad thing about NIBRs is that not all agencies are participating. And one of the things I push as hard as I can with all the law enforcement agencies that I talk to is you have to report to NIBRs. And police are their own worst enemy when it comes to data and transparency.
Yep.
It's like pulling teeth. Even when I worked in the mayor's office in Seattle, I couldn't get data from the police department. And it hurts them so much because other people will get data on them and they'll come up with their own analysis and their own conclusions, and the police department's left saying, oh, that's not right.
Yep.
So there's absolutely no way. The only way that data can hurt you is if you're doing something wrong. And so there's zero reason in this, particularly in this day and age, to not disclose as much as possible about what your officers are doing. And in the end, that will help to educate the community, and not just how many times do officers use their taser, but how many, why are officers using their taser? What are the situations where tasers are used? What was the justification for using the taser? What were the results of the taser, injuries and so forth, and all types of use of force. So if I mean, like for example, California, almost very few agencies in California report to NIBRs. So they're just like a black hole for data in this. But Washington State's very good about reporting to NIBRs, and most agencies do. And we can learn so much about what police are doing and why they're doing it in Washington that we can't in California.
So real quick, I know Kelly and Finesse have something, but that's part of the whole community, the community members that are listening. You can ask that of your agency. Why aren't you reporting this? And let your elected officials, talk to them about how important it is for them to report what's happening. I mean, what kind of use of force reports are you doing? Your professional standards reports, those types of things. Those are questions that you have the right to ask of your law enforcement agency. So don't take that. And just real quick about the Washington Post, I'm actually Kelly and Finesse now. I've been looking at Washington Post in the year 2020. I'm looking at 2020. There are 1,019 that were killed, and you're right. The media use that and pushes it out there, and they're like, they killed 1,019 people. But yeah, already I found 100 of them. The bad guy pointed the gun at the officer first. So what, come on now, what are you supposed to do? He pointed a gun at the officer. And like I said, and they're justified. So the media kind of portrays the officers killed 1,000 folks, but when you start getting down to the nuts and bolts of that, they're justified. You may not like it, but it's justified based on the laws of and all that kind of stuff. So okay, guys.
One of my big pet peeves with the federal government and the FBI is that when James Comey was director of the FBI, he started the national use of force data collection, and the whole goal was to make deadly force and serious bodily injury data available to the public. And so they've collected data from it's only about 40% of agencies, but 7,000 or 8,000 agencies now, and they have a lot of data, and they refuse to release it.
Wow.
So you had like a massive effort by law enforcement. You have an electronic data system, and you have an electronic database full of use of force, deadly force data, and serious bodily injury that would because the Washington Post and all these other, they're just crowdsourced from media, right? There's no way to check the accuracy of the data. But here's an official data source of deadly force data that they're sitting on and refusing. And I did a FOIA request, and they said they denied my request, and then I appealed, and I won my appeal, and then they said, okay, it will take 7,422 days to get you the database.
Wow.
And so the politics that must be involved in creating this national database and not releasing any data is just mind-blowing.
So what day are you on now, Bob? May I ask?
I think it's 240. I think I've got like 5 or 6 years left to wait.
Oh my
But I
gosh.
still haven't. I just haven't gotten around to filing my FOIA lawsuit to try to speed things up a bit. But they said it was really funny because they said, well, if you reduce your request to 100 records, we can do it in 6 months. And I'm like, well, what's 100 records is not, but they have a database. They have an electronic database. It should be pushing a button. And I said, just give me the electronic database. I don't want printouts or anything. Just give me the electronic database. And it's,
Wow.
but again, there's no other use for this data except for to make it available to the public. That's what it was designed to do. And what I don't understand is they make all the NIBRS data. I can download an entire state's worth of NIBRS data, and it's fantastic. But the use of force, they produced 4 charts with their data and put that on their website. And the charts don't even have any numbers on them. They're just percentages. So you don't even know what the numbers are.
Oh.
But that's the other problem with all of this stuff is the politics that are involved in policing now are really frustrating.
Well, speaking of politics, when it comes to the policing, which is ridiculous, I've noticed that you've been posting quite a bit about consent decrees. The DOJ really is holding up a lot of things for police reform. I'm sorry for our listeners, DOJ is the acronym for Department of Justice. But I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about that and how that's really putting a stain on what we're trying to do reform-wise.
Sure. So when I was a prosecutor and I worked as a public safety policy advisor, I mean, I was actually a special assistant U.S. attorney for a while, handling gun crimes in the U.S. Attorney's office in Seattle. And I had a fantastic relationship with DOJ, and we worked on many projects together. I would frequently go to conferences and meetings in DC. It was great. And then when in 2011, the Department of Justice, the Civil Rights Division in the Department of Justice, which is very separate from all the other FBI, ATF, et cetera, but they launched a pattern of practice investigation. And so then I was assigned to represent the city. And I thought, okay, and everybody in Seattle thought, oh, it's okay, because Seattle was always touted as one of a model agency where we did lots of stuff with de-escalation and crisis intervention training, community policing. I mean, we were just top of the heap. And so we were not worried about the DOJ investigating. And I was so disillusioned by the whole process because it was 100% political, had nothing to do with policing reform. I mean, the U.S. attorney who sort of launched the investigation ended up becoming the Seattle mayor and then tried to get out of the consent decree that she imposed. I mean, there was so much politics involved, and I just got. It's one of the reasons I sort of left government. I became so disillusioned with the process and being lied to and being deceived and manipulated and for political reasons, and it had nothing to do with policing reform. And so when the DOJ released their findings, they always do a press conference. They always do a national press conference and get, it's all about the press. And so they basically investigated us for about 8 months, and it was all super secret. They wouldn't tell us anything. And the night before their press conference, they asked the mayor and the chief to come to the U.S. attorney's office, and they said, we're going to find a pattern of practice tomorrow, and we're doing a national press conference. And we all went nuts and said, what's going on? You didn't talk to us or anything. And so then they said all these things about Seattle PD and all the things that were wrong. And we said, okay, you say that what they said was that 25% of all of our uses of force were excessive or unnecessary and unconstitutional. And we said, all right, you looked at about 1,200 cases. Show us the cases that you say are unconstitutional, and we'll see because we've reviewed them all, and we didn't find 25%. Maybe 2% were out of policy, and they said, no, we won't tell you any case. It's all secret, all confidential investigation. And then we said, well, okay, so you won't show us the cases. You won't show us how you came up with that number. Give us your list of recommendations of reforms, and we will implement every one of them without question, guaranteed. And they said, no. we have to force you. We have to force you to reform. And you can only do that with a monitor and $1 million a year and a federal judge, and you can't voluntarily reform. And so it
Wow.
was just the worst thing. And then so we went back and forth for about 8 months, and the mayor and the city council were at odds because the city council wanted the consent decree, the mayor didn't, the police chief didn't want it, but the city attorney did. And in the end, it was a political decision to sign the consent decree, because if the mayor didn't sign it, then the city council president said he would sign it. And so after it's been 11 years, the city spent more than $200 million. The consent decree is still ongoing. They've eliminated some aspects of it, but racial disparities have increased, skyrocketed. And crime has skyrocketed. The department is at its lowest staffing levels in history. Nobody wants to be a Seattle police officer because of all the onerous. I mean, basically, consent decrees are about reducing the amount of policing. That's all they're about. Reduce the number of stops, reduce the number of arrests, reduce the number of uses of force, reduce the number of complaints. And so there's no more proactive policing that goes on in Seattle. It's all reactive. And this is the same in every single consent decree city. And so there is no city that has benefited from a consent decree, and they've all suffered immensely. And that's sort of one of the reasons. I mean, I could talk all day about consent decrees, but that's why I post about it all the time on LinkedIn, because there's so much misunderstanding and misconception about what a consent decree is and what it can do, and the harm that results, because you've got basically lawyers coming in both from the monitoring team and the DOJ and the federal judge, basically running a police department without any experience or knowledge of policing or public safety. And they don't care about the community. Community doesn't matter at all. It's all about controlling the department and getting those numbers down as much as possible.
Wow, thank you for that. That's the reason why I brought it up, is just because this, also connects back to data, and, hearing you saying that they don't care about the communities at all. Just hopefully this
they don't care about data either. They
right,
hate
yeah,
data.
right. Like
yeah.
and that's the thing. Hopefully someone who's listening to this, who may unfortunately be in this situation, being in one of those communities, can definitely listen to this and say, hey, go to the department, go to whoever you can, to say we need to start collecting data about this to change things. So thank you for that.
So also, because I was going to ask Bob back, but since we're doing it, Bob, you may not have to come back. So we're talking about the consent decree, because I was going to wait that for. But I thank that finesse. Oh, let's just stick with that for just a second, though. Let's talk about. You said the community is not involved. So once it's public that DOJ is here and they do their, they find out there is some issue, right? Once they find out there is some issue, there's no real need. They can just tell us what those issues are, and as a community, can the community say, elected official, city manager, let's just deal with what they found out. Don't sign anything with them. Is that a possibility? Is that something that our community members can know, that is something they can ask for and require, or ask of their elected official if the Department of Justice comes in, finds out the dirt, if there is dirt, but not sign a contract to let them come in and do the work? That the community has to be involved, because obviously the community knows their local law enforcement. So I just want to make sure the community knows they have the power to at least say to the folks, no, we don't want you here. Thanks for what you found out. We'll take care of it.
That's exactly right. And that's what people don't understand, is that the Department of Justice has no power over local law enforcement. They cannot force cities or counties to do anything. What they do is they issue a findings letter, and they say, we find a pattern of practice of unconstitutional policing. And then they basically coerce the city into signing a consent decree. If a city says, no, I won't sign the consent decree, then the DOJ has to take them to federal court, and they have to prove by a preponderance of the evidence that there is a pattern or practice. And DOJ's never been able to do that. And there's only been one county, Alamance County, North Carolina. The Alamance County Sheriff, they found a pattern or practice of biased policing. And the Alamance County Sheriff said, I'm not signing a consent decree. And so DOJ took this little tiny county to court, and it was like 20 DOJ attorneys against the one county attorney, and DOJ lost big time because
Wow.
they presented zero evidence that there was biased policing going on. And so DOJ is terrified about going to court. So they have to, right now what they're doing is they're going to the mayors and they're saying, before they release their findings, they're getting the mayors to sign an agreement to agree to a consent decree, so that there's no sort of risk that they might wiggle out of it. But the other piece of it, in terms of the community piece, in Seattle, for example, the mayor wanted, Seattle's all about process and community involvement. And so the mayor got included in the consent decree a community police commission. I think they have about 13 members. And so the community police commission was supposed to be the community sort of advisor input into the consent decree. And basically they were at war, or still are at war, with the US attorney, because again, DOJ doesn't care. The only time DOJ cares about the community is when they're trying to get evidence and complaints about the police department. So that's when they want to talk to the community. Give us all the dirt and then we'll ignore you. And so the Community Police Commission, and there are a lot of news reports about their grievances now with DOJ and the consent decree, and they say that it's been a total waste of time and money, et cetera. But they're completely ignored by the federal judge and the monitor and DOJ. And so they'll get it all, they'll agree to whatever to get the consent decree in place, but the community is totally shut out. And once the consent decree is signed, because once the mayor signs, you're handing over the department to the federal judge, the monitor, and DOJ. You've lost, you're signing your city, and it will last more than a decade and cost more than $200 million for a major city. And I just don't have anything good to say about consent decree.
Yeah, I was going to say, how you really feel about all that, Bob?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I complain much too much on LinkedIn. That's sort of, I definitely have a reputation on LinkedIn of being a consent decree
I
complainer.
was like, the consent decrees. Why don't we talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I appreciate that for this. Yeah. Look, I kind of want to get back just a little bit to, especially these small communities. I know the work that your company does, going in and talking to the agency to try to figure out, well, how they can better have accountability with the stuff that they track. From your perspective, is there anything that we can tell the little Mayberries and the little small towns, from your perspective? What are just some little simple things that they could ask of their agency? I mean, because I had someone ask, they wanted to know of this little small community. So we don't even know about how many complaints the agency gets. So obviously, where I'm from, Durham kicks out one twice a month, or I mean, not twice a month, 2 times a year, at least at the end of the year, to be able to show we had X amount of complaints on use of force or rudeness or whatever. And you kind of have an idea. And people don't know that they can ask for that. So just some real simple stuff for these small communities who, where these community activists are, that are trying to for whatever reason, in these towns that we know, who may be running some of these communities. And so what are some of the things from your perspective, community members and people who could ask?
So in the past, it's really only been, major agencies like New York in the 1990s. New York NYPD did CompStat, which was their big data initiative and so forth. And LAPD has some in Chicago. They all have big, data analytics units and dashboards and everything. Yeah. The great thing is that in this day and age, it's so cheap and so easy to put your data online. And you can get a dashboard software for free, or for very low cost. And the great thing about dashboards, which is what we do. We do both internal and public dashboards, and we just use off-the-shelf software. And so an agency can create an interactive, because oftentimes people don't know what to ask for, right? It's really hard but if it's available in a dashboard format, then the community can interact with the data. And so they can say, okay, well, I want to see how many stops are in this month, or have stops been increasing or decreasing, or what is the most common reason that people get stopped, for traffic violation, what speeding or whatever. And what's been happening with complaints in my neighborhood or whatever else. And so with these dashboards, all you need is a spreadsheet of data, and you can create these very user-friendly, useful tools that the community can start. And then what we found is that once the community starts looking at the data and actually interacting with the data, then they know what to ask for. And they say, well, I'd really like to know what this data isn't here, but I'd like to know, so something about that the data is not there, and then it'd be easy to collect and add that to the dashboard. So it's just so easy, so cheap now, and so my suggestion is that for smaller communities, if their department's not providing any data, just ask them to say, look, can whatever data you currently have in an electronic format, can you just put it on in a dashboard, whether it's stops or arrests or searches or complaints, and just start to because it's really an interactive process. It's not like a lot of departments, they'll produce like an annual report, right? And it'll just it might have a few stats in it. And that's not, it's just what the department wants you to see. And there's no way to query that. But with a dashboard, you say, okay, well, we're going to put our crime stats in a dashboard format for the last 5 years online. And then people will start, our online dashboards are super popular. We thousands of hits every month, and we get a lot of feedback on the dashboards from community members about what things they'd like to see and the formatting and so forth. So it's a great way for departments to engage and to provide their data in a very accessible format.
Cool. Good. I'm not even familiar with that. I don't even know what to tell somebody. So I would just say, ask for dashboard. Is there? I'll try to. I'll look it up. I'll Google it.
Yeah. Well, the two most common dashboard software that's out there are Microsoft Power BI and then Salesforce's Tableau. And both of them have very inexpensive or free versions. And you can post any of these dashboards online, because a lot of these smaller departments, that's been the real problem, is that they don't have their own crime analyst or data analyst, and they don't have a good IT person or something like that. And so I'm not an IT person, and it's so easy. It's some of the easiest software I've ever used, and it's just making that request is, can you put, and you don't have to ask for any, because every department has some data electronically that they could put in a dashboard format. And so you're not asking them to do any kind of big project or do additional data collection. It's just like, hey, could you put, and the easiest stuff is crime data. And a lot of agencies will spend money. I don't think it's a good use of money, but to these crime mapping programs. And it's just a map with different crimes and everything like that. And it's okay, but it's sort of complicated. What you want is a summary of the data, right? You want charts and graphs and trend lines so that you can understand what's happening. The individual location of crimes is not that interesting or helpful for most people, I don't think, but a lot of that is already out there.
Okay.
Well, cool. I think, it goes to the fact that what Bob said is, when you're asking for it, just you can literally walk into the department and say, hey, I'm looking for number of arrests. Do you have a report? Do you have anything online? But another point that I want to bring up, Bob, and you mentioned it earlier, was FOIA. And as a previous analyst, law enforcement analyst, data analyst for the DC Police Department, I cannot tell you how much I loathed people and whenever I had a FOIA request. So for those listening, they may not know what a FOIA request is and when it should be utilized. So can you just kind of give a little bit of background about that, please?
Sure. So a lot of states will have public records laws, and depending on what state you're in, you can get a lot of information from the police department from your state public records laws. There's also the federal FOIA Freedom of Information Act. But I agree that like, and a lot of these crowdsourced sites and like, the Washington Post, Mapping Police Violence, Fatal Encounters, they do a lot of public records requests to get data on deadly force incidents and so forth. So if your department, if you ask nice and say, hey, we'd like to get some more data online, and they say no, we're not going to give you anything, then you could start, filing public records requests, and they may, and oftentimes what happens is that if a department gets a lot of public records requests for some type of information, a lot of times they will just post it online because it's easier to post it online than to respond to 100 public records requests. So if they're not being cooperative, you can request that information officially. And if they refuse to give it to you and it's disclosable, then that can generate a lawsuit and so forth. And because there are remedies if they refuse to disclose public records. So depending on what your state laws are, like in California, it's harder than in Washington, for example, to get public records from police. But you're right, Vanessa. I mean, it's like you don't like, it's a lot of work for an agency. So if they can avoid the work and just say, okay, we'll just put it online so that everybody can see it, that could be one way to do it.
Perfect. Thank you for that. I just want everyone who is listening to know you have rights. You can file a FOIA request. They have to give you that information. So sorry about that, BJ. I just wanted to add that little tidbit in there.
No. This is you know better than I. You know better than I. Kelly, you got anything?
No, I just wanted just asking those questions, really kind of just what to ask when you're getting that information from the media and that kind of thing, to just start critically thinking about the information that you're being told. And I think that kind of will help, because I think when people first see the data, they're like, oh, that sounds about right. They just take it as word. And so just kind of encouraging people to start thinking about the information and where it's coming from. And that'll kind of start to help you generate questions to ask your government officials. So just starting there.
Cool, thanks.
That's a great point.
Go ahead, Bob.
I just want to say that's a great point, is that what I always say is that, data is just a starting point, right? I mean, data is not going to answer all your questions, but data can help point you in the right direction. And say, all right, we seem to have an issue with use of force here, because our use of force rates are higher than average, or we seem to get a lot of complaints about use of force. But you have to go beyond the data. You have to dig deeper, and you have to have discussions with the department and really dig into policies and training and why things are the way they are. And oftentimes people will just stop at the data and say, oh, there's a disparity here, therefore, there must be something wrong. So let's pass a new ordinance or something to try to fix it.
So we're almost getting close to it, but I kind of want to touch about what we talked about in the beginning, that you just had this research paper that you and your colleagues just released, and we want to talk about that just a little bit. Threat Dynamics and Police Use of Force is the title of the research. And Vanessa, she skimmed it. I've looked through it, spent most of the day kind of going through it. And one of the things that I wanted to talk about and get you to talk about briefly is, from my perspective and the work that I do, I really like what you're doing, have done with this, and looking at the totality of what police officers use, what that looks like, and that interaction, and the fact that we also have to take into consideration the community member that's involved with that. And what the officer is looking at. I mean, you're looking at an individual who's intoxicated, who could be a threat, but officers are always going to be seeing someone with a gun as a threat, so they're going to act accordingly. But those are different, and there can be biases built into that, but there's a process and there's a perspective of a police officer. You and I may go to the same house and a guy's intoxicated, and I may interact with him based on some of the stuff that I've done, or what I've dealt with individuals who have been intoxicated, and know what they're going to do based on that intoxication. If they're emotional, you may have a different way of doing that as well. So it does really filter in to how law enforcement, even though we've been trained the same way. So I really appreciate what you guys have done with this research, but I just kind of want to put it out there for folks to understand that it's a totality that has to do with the Supreme Court rulings. I'm not going to get into that, but just the fact that we have to remember that there's another individual involved in this. What is the person doing? What is the intent? Or are there the opportunity to do something, and those types of that? It's bigger than just the officer using the use of force, his or her perspective, and then how the person is interacting with that person, and then all these other things that come in. Obviously, race sometimes plays into that, the perspective, seeing a young Black youth and making an assumption he or she is older, the body, the size of an individual. I mean, I'm not exactly a very small person, but I have been in the presence of 200+ pounds individuals. And so that's a different kind of look for me if I'm a law enforcement officer, and the things that I may end up having to do. So just kind of talk about that. I don't know whether Finesse and Kelly, if you guys had a time to skim it. Finesse said she skimmed it, but I just kind of want to have Bob kind of talk about it, because I'd like, to know that. And at the end of it, the end of the story is that the body worn camera, reviewing those can complement the use of force and how we do that, because now we're not just taking the community members or the media saying the community member did X. We have this on video. We know what the officer did that may have contributed to this interaction going south, and we also have a community member who may have contributed to this interaction going south as well. So now everybody gets to have a little sticky. And so just kind of talk about that for just a few minutes, Bob, if you don't mind.
Sure. So use of force is a very complex and dynamic event. And it's not just like an on-off switch, use of force, not use of force. And so we need to know like everything that led up to the use of force. How long did it take? What was the interaction between the officer and the suspect, before force was used? What was the trigger, right? That made, what was it that made that officer decide to use force at that moment? And then once the force starts, what are all the dynamics of back and forth? Because you have to look at the resistance levels, and was the suspect potentially armed, or how are they resisting physically? Were they just running away, or were they fighting the officer? And how long did that use of force go on, and how difficult was it for the officer to control the subject? What kind of physical tactics or weapons did the officer use? And then what happened after the force? And so how were they restrained? And did they have leg restraints? Were they handcuffed? Did they continue to resist? Were they injured? Was the officer injured? Were they booked into jail? Were they released? And so as I said, we collect up to 150 different data variables on each incident. And once we look at the sort of totality of the circumstances, we can start to analyze not just how many times did an officer use a taser, but what were all the incidents that led up to that taser use, and how do officers use tasers compared to other weapons, and what types of incidents and so forth. And so what we're able to do when we collect all these different data elements is we can say, so less than 2% of use of force is found to be out of policy. So 98% of the time, the officers following policy every time they used force, following their policies and training. But what we found is within that 98%, there's a huge range in how officers use force. And some of the officers, even though everything's within policy, they may not be behaving exactly how you would like, or certainly not like these officers up here. And so the goal is to help the department say, okay, yes, even though 98% of your things are within policy, there are a group of officers here that are higher risk, right? They may be quicker to use force. They may not use force as effectively. Like there's some officers that are extremely effective at the use of physical tactics, and they're usually maybe trained in martial arts. And so they can control a subject very quickly with minimal injury, with very little force at all. Just because they're so skilled at it. And that's what we see in agencies like we did a grant project for 16 agencies in Dane County, Wisconsin, where Madison is. And they have a regional training center, and they really focus on martial arts. And they almost never use any weapons. I mean, it's like rarely. because they're all very highly skilled in martial arts training. And so, whereas in Washington State, there's a heavy reliance on taser. And for whatever reason, the state training academy and different policies, and so about a quarter of all use of force is a taser in Washington State. And there are pros and cons to every type of force tactic, and there's no like one size fits all. But it really shows how your training and your policies really do impact how officers behave. And so if you want them to behave in a certain way, then you equip them the way you want them to behave, and you train them, and you have the right policies, and then you monitor to make sure that they're in compliance. And so one of the things our research papers, we've done a number of different research papers, but the most recent one on threat assessment is looking at the levels of threat that the subject presents to the officer, and how those officers react to those different levels of threat. And one of the things that we've found is that not only training and policies, but experience matters, and not just the number of years you're a police officer, but the number of uses of force you've done. So if an officer has a lot of use of force, that's generally a good thing, because it doesn't mean that they're using excessive or unnecessary force. What it means is that they've been on patrol for a long time, and they're making a lot of arrests. And we've on average about 4% of arrests result in a use of force. You're never going to get 100% compliance when you're arresting some group of people. So if 4% of if you're making 1,000 arrests and 4% are resisting, then you're going to get a lot of experience using force. And so, whereas officers who rarely use force, generally they're either newer officers or officers that have been in specialized units or that kind of thing, or administrative. And when they get on the street, and the first time you use your taser, you're probably not going to use it as well, as effectively as somebody who's used their taser 100 times before. And so we can't just look at the number of times things happen. We have to look at, is this the most appropriate use of force? And also, the more effective the officer is, once the decision has been made to use force, you want to control the subject as quickly as possible. So if you go in with a very low level of physical force against somebody who's bigger and stronger than you are, chances are you're going to end up getting hurt yourself, hurting the subject, having more officers come in, having to use weapons, as opposed to going in with, I couldn't be a police officer. It's too complex for me, for my brain to handle. Like, what's the best thing to do in this situation? Right? What level of force should I use? Should I use any weapons? At what point should I use force? It's extremely complex. And so being able to have the data to show in this kind of situation, or these kind of officers with this training, they're extremely effective at using force and controlling the subject very quickly with a minimal risk of injury. That's really what you're going for.
You guys got anything?
After that,
Yeah.
no, I just think it's absolutely fascinating. But I never really thought of it when you start to consider the officer's perspective of a subject being a threat, and how that also dictates the amount or how often they use use of force. It's just really fascinating, because it also brings to light of when you see an officer who's using too much force, but it's unnecessary, right? Because they clearly have the individual under control. There's no need for the amount of force that they're utilizing. They're no longer a threat. So this is just all so complex. It really is complex. I'm just taking it all in, but I hate to say it, it's so awesome.
Yeah, and Bob, that's saying something to Quiet Finesse. So I'm just listening.
I know.
Good.
You've done a lot.
Kelly, do you have anything?
I know, right?
I just think it's really interesting how you
Yeah.
kind of, when I was reading the article, just how it's broken down, and there's so many different dynamics that have to play a part. And just the fact that one of the things I was thinking about when I was reading was, if there was a way to get, because I know a lot of it is based off of narrative experiences from those officers. So obviously the first person that's going to report is going to be the officer. That's whose story is going to be told. But I don't know, it's just a thought of how do we incorporate maybe the person that was arrested's perspective into that data to maybe even just look at what their perceptions of that officer was. I don't know, just a thought.
Yeah, no, I mean, there are, I mean, the reason that we focus on the officer statements and the incident reports is because that is the best record that we have of the incident that we can get. Now we also have video camera, and so the other thing is that the officers, all officers have to sign their statements under penalty of perjury. It has to be reviewed by a supervisor. If a complaint is filed, they're going to investigate the whole incident. So it's pretty high reliability in terms of the accuracy. We don't see a lot of, for example, discrepancies in between officers and so forth. Now that doesn't mean that there aren't officers that may lie or do that kind of thing, but it's pretty low incidence for that. So one of the things that we do is we do some auditing with body cam footage, where we'll read the report and we'll code everything based on our criteria, and then we'll watch the body cam footage and we'll do the same thing, and see how closely our coding matches with the written report. And one of the things that's really interesting is we rarely see major discrepancies, but where we do see discrepancies, it's like the people who are the trained coders who are reviewing the videos and me, when I see a situation, I'm much more likely to perceive a threat than the officer is, because I'm just watching the video and I say, hey, this guy's swearing at me and threatening me and everything else, and I perceive that as a pretty high level of threat, where the officer in their statement, they may not even mention it. Right, because they're used to it, right? This happens all the time. And so that's where we see the discrepancies, is that the officers are so sort of desensitized to a threat that a layperson would think, oh wow, this is a really threatening situation. And so that's what's been really interesting, is that I think in many ways officers may understate things in their report when they feel threatened. It takes a lot to make an officer feel threatened, I think.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I think that's a
That's
good.
really cool.
I got to think that we can wrap it up, but I think that's a really good thing, because that does play. Because after a while, if you're trained, because people cuss at you all the time and they're yelling and screaming at you, and you at some point during your career, you go, okay, just blow it off and go ahead and do what you just leave, right? Because we're not receiving that anymore. As a young officer, I may receive that as a threat, or why you pissing me off, I'm getting ready to snatch you up in the collar. But as we mature, he says he running his mouth, just leave the property, and I'm not gonna put my hands, and I don't have to use any force. So that does have an impact, because after a while, you do become, especially that verbal stuff, and even sometimes people walking up on you, you just feel like that's just part of his or her persona, and it's like, I know when when they've crossed it, and for you, they crossed it early on. As soon as their mouth started running your mouth. For me, it just may be different. So that you're totally correct on that. That's just how that officer is. So yeah, this has been really. Yeah, go ahead.
Can I just say one thing? That's a really important point, because one of the things I found in the videos, it's watching the videos, is that officers get into real trouble when they take it personally, right? When they get wrapped up, right? And so if you can just blow it off, right? I mean, obviously, if it's a real threat, right, you want to take action. But when officers get in, it's usually the verbal arguments. When I see officers get into a verbal argument with somebody, they tend to use force inappropriately, because they're mad, right? If you get mad, you're gonna react, when you have to use force. So that's a really important point.
Yeah, and hopefully the BWCs will be able to start showing that, especially for young officers in today, because kids today are just sensitive. I mean, words. People saying words on videos are getting people killed. So if you got that generation doing that and they got a uniform on, it could escalate for no reason at all. So yeah. So
Can I
Bob,
make a,
yeah, go ahead. Go
I'm
ahead.
so sorry. I have a quick
No.
confession to make. I found myself at 2 o'clock in the morning the other night, so I couldn't sleep, on YouTube watching body work camera footage. And I agree with Bob that a lot of these people who are walking up to these officers and and being verbally abusive, and they're just the patience that they have with people is absolutely insane. So I can definitely, I'm not working with Bob, but I will say that I've been on YouTube going down a very deep hole watching body work camera footage. So I understand.
There's a lot of it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's funny. At 2 o'clock, you had nothing else to do, right?
Nothing else to do.
That's funny. Oh man, Bob, thank you. This has been a lot of help, and I hope our listeners have got some information they can use back in their communities and stuff like that. And I really appreciate you coming on and enlightening us to what to ask, the research and everything like that, and the analysis. So that hopefully will be helpful. So thank you so much.
Thank you so
Bob.
much. Thank you. It's been really enjoyable. I really had a good time.
Cool. Thank you.
Great.
So then you want to say goodbye? What what you got? Just want to holler at everybody?
Yeah, just thanks everyone for listening to us, our shenanigans once again. And Bob, thank you so much for coming on. This was a lot of fun, and I learned a lot. So it was great.
Thanks.
Cool. Kelly.
Yep, thank you guys for tuning in. And it was great like meeting everybody and just kind of having these good conversations.
Yeah, and again, thank you for listening in to Your Questions, Your Power. And if go to my website, my email is there. If you have questions in relationship to what you can ask your agency or things, please let us know and we'll discuss that. Kelly and Vanessa, we like getting on and chatting. So we would love to hear from you about that. And for those of you first time here, thanks for tuning in. Hope you'll join us again. And for those of you that are always listen to us, we really appreciate it. So as always, stay well, stay safe, peace.